There's a circus that only opens after dark. It arrives without warning, no posters, no announcement, just a field that was empty yesterday, and a wall of striped black and white tents standing there today. Above the gates hangs a sign that reads, "Opens at nightfall, closes at dawn." And inside at the very center of it stands a clock that shouldn't be possible. Every hour, tiny figures move wings, unfold. A phoenix rises from ash and burns and rises again, and the whole thing is black and white and gold, exactly like the circus around it. Almost nobody who walks through those gates knows this clock and everything else inside exists, because two people were raised from childhood to fight a duel where the loser doesn't just lose the game. The loser dies. This is the Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. And the story actually starts years before the circus ever opens, with a man named Hector Bowen, who performs under the stage name Prospero the Enchanter. Prospero has a daughter, Celia, and when she's still a child, he tests whether she's inherited his real magic in the coldest way possible. He breaks her finger and tells her to fix it herself. She does. That's how her training begins. At the same time in London, a mysterious man, known only as Alexander, is training a different child, an orphan boy named Marco, teaching him magic through old books, rituals, and rigorous discipline instead of raw instinct. Neither Prospero nor Alexander ever properly explains the game to their students. Prospero simply gives Celia a ring to wear as a binding mark. Alexander gives Marco similar instructions. Both children are told they're being prepared for a competition. Neither is told what winning or losing actually costs. That's the part worth sitting with for a second, because it's not just fantasy. Somewhere out there's a version of Celia and a version of Marco walking around right now. Someone who ended up in a career their parents picked for them before they could talk. Someone still living out expectations they never agreed to. The prison Celia and Marco are born into isn't locked with a key. It's inherited quietly before they're old enough to ask any questions about it. Years later, the venue for their competition gets built, and this is where the story gets its name. A wealthy, eccentric man named Chandresh Christophe Lefebvre, who runs a strange club called the Midnight Dinners, decides to create the most extraordinary circus the world has ever seen. He gathers a designer, a contortionist, a fortune teller, eventually a clockmaker, named her Friedrich Thiessen, who builds that impossible black and white clock at the entrance. Chandresh has no idea he's actually building the arena for a duel. He just wants to build something magnificent. He names it Le Cirque de Rêves, the Circus of Dreams. And this is where you start to understand what core idea 2 of this story really is. Everything about this circus looks effortless. Visitors wander through it and see a garden made entirely of ice that never melts a cloud, maze you can walk straight through, a wishing tree covered in candles that visitors light one by one. It looks like magic that costs nothing. It isn't. Celia, performing under the stage name La Resistance, secretly builds that ice garden herself piece by piece, using real magic disguised as elaborate stage illusion. Marco, working quietly behind the scenes as Chandresh's assistant, designs the cloud maze and the wishing tree from London, never once stepping foot in the circus himself for years. Every tent the audience walks through in wonder cost one of them something. Hours, discipline, pieces of themselves they don't get back. That's not just true inside this book. Think about anyone you admire whose life looks effortless from the outside. You're only ever seeing the finished tent, never the years it took to build it. Here's what makes it more complicated. Neither Celia nor Marco knows at first that the other person building all this magic is their actual opponent. Every creation one of them adds to the circus the other has to top. Celia's ice garden gets answered by Marco's cloud maze. His wishing tree gets answered by something even more astonishing from her. Neither of them fully understands the rules of this game because nobody ever explained them properly. All they know is that it never stops, and it seems to keep escalating. That pressure ironically makes both of them extraordinary. Competing against each other pushes their imaginations further than either could have gone alone. That's core idea 3, and it's worth borrowing for your own life. Real competition can sharpen you, but when your whole identity depends on outdoing someone else, you stop asking the question that actually matters, which is what you're even trying to become. Two people quietly outcompeting each other with more and more elaborate magic escalating endlessly is exactly what happens when winning stops being the point and just becomes the habit. And now here's the twist most readers don't expect. When Celia finally meets Marco in person years into the circus's existence, they don't recognize each other as opponents at first. They recognize something else entirely. Someone who understands imagination the exact same way they do. It's only after that connection forms that the truth lands on both of them. They're not just two people who think alike. They're the two players in a duel that was always designed to end with one of them gone. That single discovery breaks the entire premise the story was built on. Because what does it even mean to win a game like this if winning means destroying the one person who actually understands you? Celia and Marco fall in love anyway. And once they do, they start looking for a way out of a game. Neither of them ever agreed to play a game that was rigged before either of them was old enough to say no to it. That's core idea 4. Life hands all of us goals that feel like everything right up until something more important shows up. A promotion feels urgent until your child is born. Being right feels important until you realize the relationship matters more. Celia and Marco are staring down a version of that same wall, except the stakes for them are literally life and death. That's when Sekiko enters the story properly. She's a contortionist who has performed with the circus since it opened, and it eventually becomes clear she was a player in an earlier version of this exact game decades before Celia and Marco were even born. She lost, and somehow she survived anyway, bound permanently to fire and to the circus itself. Her presence is the first real proof that this game has been played before, and that losing doesn't necessarily mean disappearing. It can mean something stranger and more permanent. As the story builds towards climax, Celia realizes the only way to actually save Marco and end the game without either of them dying the way the rules intended is to bind her own life force directly into the circus itself. She does it. She becomes in a very real sense the circus. Marco, unable to accept losing her, finds his own way to bind himself to it as well. The two of them end up existing inside Le Cirque de Rêves itself together in a way that isn't quite alive and isn't quite gone, keeping the entire circus running from somewhere inside its own walls. It's a strange ending, but it lands on core idea 5 perfectly because none of this survives without everyone else around them. A fortune teller named Isabel, who's also in love with Marco, spends years using her own tarot cards to unknowingly help hold the circus's magic together, even when she doesn't fully understand what she's protecting. Her Thiessen keeps that clock precisely maintained. A local boy named Bailey, who fell in love with the circus as a child and befriended 2 unusual twins named Poppet and Widget, who were both born the very night the circus first opened, ends up being the one who inherits responsibility for keeping the whole thing alive once the original generation grows too old to manage it. No one person built this. Prospero and Alexander started the game. Chundresh built the circus. Celia and Marco kept it alive through everything they sacrificed. Thiessen, Isabel, Sekiko, and eventually Bailey, Poppet, and Widget carried it forward. Strip out any single one of them, and the whole thing collapses. Which brings us to the idea sitting underneath everything else in this story. The life you build matters more than the competition you were told to win. Prospero and Alexander built this entire game around proving whose method was superior whose student was stronger, whose magic was real. That was the whole point as far as either of them ever cared. And by the end, Celia and Marco discover something neither man ever valued. Creating something beautiful together mattered more than defeating each other. Choosing each other mattered more than obeying the men who raised them for exactly this purpose. Nobody visits Le Cirque de Rêves because they heard someone finally won a duel. They visit because of how it makes them feel. The wonder of it, the mystery of it. That's what outlasts the entire premise the story started with. So here's something you can actually do with that today. Take 5 minutes and write down 2 short lists. On the first 3 things you're currently chasing right now, whatever that looks like for you. On the second 3 relationships or experiences that make your life genuinely feel worth living. Then ask yourself honestly, are your daily choices actually building the second list or only feeding the first one? You don't need to blow up your whole life over the answer. Just pick one small thing today that moves you toward what's actually on that second list. The Night Circus ends the way it begins at nightfall, with that same impossible clock still keeping time at the entrance. 2 people who were raised their whole lives to destroy each other found a way to stay together instead, even if it meant becoming something the rules never accounted for. Long after any game is over, nobody remembers who won it. They remember what it felt like to walk through those gates for the first time. And maybe that's the only kind of magic worth building a life around.